Okay, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is going to be presented in with English and French translation. If you would like to choose either language, please use the button on the bottom lower left of your screen. I'm really pleased and honored to be here today. My name is Crystal Gale Fraser. I am Gwich'ya Gwich'in, originally from Inuvik and Dechancho Genjik in the Northwest Territories. I am an intergenerational residential school survivor. I'm also a historian of Indian residential schooling in Canada, and I work at the University of Alberta in history and Native studies. And I'm very grateful to be coming to you today from Treaty 6 homeland of the Métis Nation, just outside of Edmonton, Alberta. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to today's panelists. First, however, I'm really honored to invite Kukdookaa, Terri Brown, to provide welcoming and a prayer. Terri is a survivor of Indian residential school and also a former chief of the Tahltan Nation. She has been a longtime advocate for survivors and their families and is a member of the Circle of Survivors that guides the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials. So I will invite Terri to come on. If you want to turn your video and microphone on, you can lead us into the next part.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's doing fine today. Yes, I've been involved. I was with the TRC before we had the center, and been involved for years before we had the agreement with the AFN and the other organizations. I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for your commitment to the work that we're doing, and that you do make a difference for survivors and the intergenerational people, you know, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So thank you very much for that. I'll say a prayer. Aktigadenatia, Madu Soga Esta, Tlagu Este, Tlagu Este, the little babies. Creator of all, bless everyone who's on this in the meeting today, and bless their kind hearts for the work they have done for us. And keep them strong, keep them safe in everything that they do. Bless their children and grandchildren and those yet unborn. Creator of all, please help us to be strong in doing this work. The babies are waiting for us. They've been waiting for decades. Please help them to stop crying and stop hurting and reunite in the great beyond with their families, their grandparents, ancestors, and their dear mothers who have lost them many years ago. Creator of all, please be with all the people, the survivors and intergenerational survivors who are in the streets and suffering. Creator, show them the light in a better way. Bless them and heal them. Look after all our nations right across the country, because we all have been hurting for generations and we deserve a better life. Creator of all, thank you for all the people at the National Research Center in Winnipeg. They've been doing this work for many years. Keep them strong and give them your love and guidance, and protect them spiritually, because we all need that. And Creator of all the little babies across the country, give them happiness and a good life. Give all our children a good life. And as we think about the great beyond where we're going to join them again, please be ready for us and give us comfort and give our families comfort. Creator of all, bless us all today and give us what we need to proceed as peoples and as our friends who have decided to help us. Aktigadenatia, mad to all my relations. Thank you very much.
Hi, Cho. Thank you so much for that. Before we continue, we would also like to have a moment of silence to give us a chance to reflect in our own ways on the reasons why we are here today. Our common goal of honoring the children who never had the chance to return home. So I'll ask you to join me in a moment of silence now. Thank you. So the webinar today is sponsored by the National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children, and Unmarked Burials. The National Advisory Committee was formed last year to assist First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities and families in order to gain access to reliable and trustworthy information about all aspects of the search for missing children. We do this by freely sharing the knowledge of our individual members and by promoting information sharing among communities that have already developed great expertise and experience through the work that they are already engaged in. Since you found this webinar, you've probably already seen the advisory committee website. Just in case you haven't, the address is nac-cnn.ca. And we will also share this link in the chat. We have collected an extensive list of resources such as videos, FAQs, and background papers around the many key elements of the search process. We have also published a short introductory overview to navigating community options, and this is all available on the website. Additionally, the 24-hour National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is also ongoing to support former Indian Residential School students. Individuals can call 1-866-925-4419 to access emotional and crisis referral services. This morning, we're going to be talking about preparing to carry out a ground search. We are fortunate enough to have a panel of experts with extraordinary first-hand experience in carrying out these kinds of searches. I will share a few words of introduction about each and then turn the floor over to them. Our presentations are going to take approximately an hour. We do have some time for a break. And then we will ask the panelists to answer any questions from the chat. So please note your questions as you are listening to them, and we can address that afterwards. So our first speaker will be Kisha Supernant of the Institute for Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology. Dr. Supernant is a Métis archaeologist. She is also the director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology and a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. She has been helping Indigenous communities design and carry out ground searches for unmarked graves using various technologies for several years. She is also a member of the National Advisory Committee on Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. After Kisha, we will be joined by Charlene Belleau. Charlene is a residential school survivor from the Esquetem, sorry, I may have mispronunciated that, a First Nation in British Columbia. She is also a former chief of that nation. Charlene has served as a manager of the Indian Residential Schools Unit of the Assembly of First Nations and as the chair of the First Nations Health Authority. She currently works for the BC Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation as a liaison between the government and First Nations engaged in the search process. Our third speaker is Whitney Spearing. Whitney is an archaeologist working for the Williams Lake First Nation in British Columbia. She has worked for Williams Lake First Nation in a number of capacities, including title and rights manager. She is the project lead for their investigation into the St. Joseph Mission Indian Residential School. We will then have a presentation by Barbara Lavallee and Terrence Clark from Cowessess First Nation research team. Barbara is a residential school survivor and the lead researcher for unmarked burials and missing children from the Maryvale Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan. She leads a team drawn together from many disciplines, which includes a number of partner institutions, and she has also advised other communities. Terrence Clark is an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan who has worked in community-engaged archaeology for over 25 years. He sits on the Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group on Unmarked Indian Residential School graves. He is currently working with and advising a number of survivor communities in Western Canada on their school searches. Our final speaker for this webinar is Andrew Martindale. Andrew is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. He supports several nations in their search for missing children from residential schools. He is a member of the British Columbia Technical Committee and the National Advisory Committee on Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. So those are our speakers. I'm very honored and grateful to be able to learn from them today. And on that note, I will invite Kisha to start their presentation. Thanks, Kisha.
Thanks, Crystal. And I really want to say Kinniscomton to Terri for the opening prayer and for starting us in a good way. So I'm here today to speak with you about how to consider different aspects of preparing for a ground search in a general way before you'll hear from some examples from other colleagues. Tanse Kisha Supernant Katsan Miskutiviskaigan Chinia, Otipimisiwaknia. As introduced, I am a Métis archaeologist. I have worked with a number of different nations to provide advice and guidance and carry out ground searches. And I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory in the Métis homeland in the Miskutiviskaigan, which is the Cree word for Edmonton, Alberta. So it was already mentioned, but I do want to also just talk about the navigation document that the National Advisory Committee has prepared, because while I will be focusing on sort of technical considerations in preparing for ground searches, how to make decisions about where to search, what technologies might be helpful, and that sort of thing, there are of course many other pieces to this work. It is not just using technology in the ground searching, and there's a lot of great information both on the website as well as in this navigator document to help consider all these other pieces. My area of expertise is around the search process. So what are the different forms of technology that can be applied to locate potential unmarked graves associated with residential schools? When I do this work with community, when community approaches me to help them with this, we center some really core values in approaching this, because this is a deeply difficult and heartbreaking work to undertake. It has a lot of emotional and spiritual impacts for everyone who is involved. So we always follow community and survivor lead in the work that is done and how it's carried out. We honor the importance of ceremony as a core component of every part of this work. This is sacred work. The work itself is ceremony. We focus on how oral history and Indigenous knowledge within communities guides the work and helps determine and choose locations that need to be searched using these technologies. It's also important to clarify expectations and possibilities, and I will talk about that a little bit today, and you'll get some more information about some of the specifics of technology from Andrew Martindale later, because there are limits to what we can know with these types of technology. We also are committed to providing accurate results as quickly as possible, recognizing many communities are searching for answers. And then at the core of it, we also uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. So this is where research starts from when I do this work. And I think it's really important to come to this work with great care. So we know that there are many locations that need to be searched, and that there are many survivors and communities who are trying to understand very complex landscapes. So every school has its own history in terms of where it was located, how the grounds were used, the extent of the grounds associated with the schools, as well as what has happened to the land since that time. So all of these things are really important. And of course, we're not only thinking about institutions that were called schools, there are related institutions where children were sent when they were ill, for example, that also need to be considered. It's very, very complex, very difficult to figure out where to even begin. Generally, when I work with community, what I recommend is that before bringing out any kind of technology, there's some really important information that helps know where to look and where to start. So first is knowing where there might actually be recorded burials. Many schools had cemeteries. They were in the school plans. So where are those locations? Are they known? Do they have areas within them that need to be searched? This is important. And then identifying any records that might be in the archives relevant for understanding the school grounds, the land itself, where things might have been located, because that will help you make decisions about what technology to use. Knowing the land history is really important, and that includes what buildings were where. Are there multiple locations where the schools were located? Often they moved. Where is the land now? Who owns it? Is it on reserve? Is it in private hands? Is it in public lands? All of these will determine how to access it. Historical aerial photos are really helpful because you can get usually good photographs from the 1940s and potentially earlier in some locations, and these will actually show you the changes in the layout of the school grounds, etc., over time, and they also help target particular areas using technology that are suitable to actually survey with geophysical technology, for example. And then compiling all of this into some sort of mapping software, like a geographic information system, is also really helpful because it creates a good set of base information that you can build from. And then, of course, the survivor testimonies are key. They often will guide where the most high priority areas are to search because of their firsthand experience. We also know that there are existing cemetery records that can help provide information around burials. You can often get these from a parish. They're not necessarily ones that are held, they may be held in the NCTR, for example, but you can also often reach out to the local parish and get burial records. And then community knowledge. We know also that areas, since the school was in use, sometimes infrastructure was built and community, they found bones, for example. Those are really important considerations when trying to make decisions about locations. When you are choosing areas to search, or to search first, shall we say, to sort of try to think about what are the areas that need immediate attention, there's a few things that you can ask. So where are children who are in the records that are known to have died, where are they buried? Is it one location? Is it multiple locations? That is an important thing to consider. Where do survivors want to look? Where are the areas that multiple survivors are pointing to that need to be searched? And then what technologies are useful for those locations? What is the soil like? This is really important because not every one of the technologies works the same everywhere. I have worked at school locations, for example, where ground penetrating radar doesn't work because of the soil conditions themselves, and therefore other things need to be considered. So it's really important to have an understanding of the land and the soil, and then what technologies are useful. I'm just going to really briefly run through a few technologies that you likely have heard about or considered. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about any of them right now. but there is information about all of them on the Canadian Archaeological Association website, as well as on the National Advisory Committee website, that can give you more detailed information, and my colleague Andrew Martindale will provide more about ground penetrating radar in particular. Often you can start from the air, and there are a number of methods that you can use to narrow down areas that might require more detailed searching, or that can provide information around the history of the land. And these are various forms of cameras and sensors that are mounted on planes and drones, as well as the use of detailed satellite imagery, which is taken, of course, from satellites. There are a number of techniques that you might use in order to narrow down areas from these different kinds of sensors and cameras. So I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of them, talk about LiDAR a little bit, talk about just photography and aerial photos that might be helpful in, again, choosing specific locations, narrowing down places to do more intensive searching. The first is the use of historical aerial photos. So this is an example from work that I did with Kapawino First Nation at Gruard, where we were able to layer on older aerial photos from the 1940s and 1950s that helped us understand where the building locations were, and also helped survivors to narrow down areas that they have encountered and can remember. This is also helpful because most geophysical techniques are not particularly useful in terms of looking in building foundations. They will just show the foundation and not anything else related to potential burials. So they're actually areas that we don't prioritize because the building foundation will make anything else difficult to see. They're also really useful to see what happened over time. So as development happens or other kinds of things happen, those will show up on the aerial photos. And they're a good foundation for building other spatial data into the process. You can also, in some cases, learn quite a lot from building what we call a digital elevation model using drone photography. So this is just a camera, and it is mounted on a drone. The drone is flown over an open area, and then you can actually build kind of an elevation model. And what this will show you is changes in elevation that could correspond with unmarked graves. This requires there to be some sort of surface indicator, so a mound or a depression that the camera can pick up, and that can sometimes be mapped. This is particularly useful in historic cemeteries and in relatively open areas. So you have to have the area not be forested or underbush. If you do have areas that are forested that are of interest, this is where LiDAR, which is a type of technology where you mount a sensor on a plane or a drone, and it sends laser beams, basically beams of light down toward the ground, and you can actually start to map the surface of the earth underneath tree cover or underneath sort of a bushy area. It doesn't look below the surface. So like with the photography piece, LiDAR is useful if there is something on the surface that indicates there could be a grave. A mound or a depression, it could detect that, but it doesn't actually look below the ground itself, so can't necessarily pick up unmarked graves in areas that have been plowed or have been otherwise modified. So those are some of the things you can do from the air. There's some benefits to this. First, it's quick. It can cover large areas much more quickly than other methods. It can help narrow down potential areas that need more intensive work and investigation, and allows you to look in areas where there is already ground cover prior to, say, clearing. It does generate a large amount of data, so that can be difficult to kind of manage and process. It can't look below the surface of the earth, and therefore is not as proven to find burials. There are some aerial methods that have potential to look below the surface, but they're not as well understood in trying to find unmarked graves. And also, if the land has been really modified, aerial methods are less useful for you. So then we come to the ground-based remote sensing or geophysical techniques. There are a number of these. The most common that you've heard about is ground penetrating radar, but there are other options. All of them involve reading some sort of signal underneath the ground, whether that be sending a wave down, reading magnetic signal, sending electrical current. These are ways to get information about what's below the surface without having to dig. Andrew will go into much more detail about ground penetrating radar, but it is the most well-established method that has been used in multiple places to try to detect potential unmarked graves. It involves sending an electromagnetic wave down into the ground, and it bounces differently off different kinds of things underneath the ground. So if there's a rock or a metal pipe or just the soil itself, there are different reflections, and then we try to make sense of those reflections when we collect data in a systematic way. And Andrew will talk quite a bit more about that. A couple things to note: it doesn't show bodies. It's not an X-ray. What it is looking for is the grave shaft itself. So a pit that looks approximately the right size and shape and orientation that it could potentially be a grave, but you cannot confirm 100% with ground penetrating radar. Partly this is because graves are difficult to find with any of these techniques because they're relatively small. We rely on patterns. So if you have a cemetery where you have a pattern of disturbances that are the right size and shape and orientation, you can start to be a bit more confident that you're likely finding graves. But if you're looking at hidden or places where there isn't as much patterning, it's much more difficult. Formal and informal burials can change how we're able to interpret ground penetrating radar data. It doesn't work in all soils. If there's a lot of clay, if the area is very wet, then the ground penetrating radar is not effective. It also depends on the age and preservation of the grave. So older, smaller graves may be more challenging to find the potential locations of rather than more recent. And then it is, of course, very, very sensitive. So we have to be very careful in the application of this technology. So ground penetrating radar is good at, in certain environments, it is good at generally understanding shape and depth of particular features, but doesn't always know what it is, right? We can eliminate some things, but not everything. It requires putting the machine right on the ground. So anywhere that's forested or bushy is not good. It doesn't work everywhere. And you can never be 100% certain with ground penetrating radar that you're finding a grave. You can be more or less certain based on certain criteria, but we can't say 100% for sure. And it requires a very specific application of ground penetrating radar. Anyone who knows how to use GPR doesn't necessarily know how to use it to find graves, and there's not that many people still across the country who have the right expertise. So it's important to kind of build that capacity in community as much as possible. When GPR doesn't work, there are other options. Some of the ones that my team has worked on involve magnetic options where you're looking at differences in the magnetic field. This can often show metal objects. It's not always useful in an area where there's been a lot of activity, but there may be times when it is helpful. And then there's ways using various forms of resistivity or conductivity, and it usually involves electrical currents and similar things being sent into the ground. And where ground penetrating radar doesn't work, we've had some success using resistivity to map out potential graves, but similar limitations in terms of never being sure that we're finding a grave. However, there is a lot of benefits to using ground-based techniques. There are proven methods. There have been tests of ground penetrating radar in cemeteries, for example. We know that in good conditions, it can detect with good confidence potential graves. It's much more precise than a lot of the aerial methods, which cover big areas, but you don't get the detail about the area below the surface. And you can add these together. So ground penetrating radar and then say resistivity can be layered to make sense of things. It takes time. Most ground penetrating radar units are single channel. So you have like a box that you're pushing along the ground. They're very slow. And so it might take a week to cover an acre. And we know these landscapes are much larger than that. And it requires specific knowledge, and it's not guaranteed to work. So to sort of summarize just a few recommendations, in general, in my experience, approaching these types of surveys benefits from a phased approach where you start with high priority areas, you survey that area using the techniques, you analyze the information to see how well it's working prior to then going back and doing more. This may not work for every community, but in my experience, it has helped the communities that I've worked with. Knowing that finding graves is a specific application of the technology, that it's not something that anyone who knows how to use it can do, and that it needs that kind of expertise, that it cannot confirm the presence of graves without additional investigation. So it's a way to narrow down areas that require investigation, but can't confirm the presence of graves. You need to be careful about who you're bringing in to do the survey. There are companies who are doing good work, but there are others who don't have experience in these areas who are perhaps not the best choice. And then wherever possible, communities should build internal capacity to do this. And ground searching is only, of course, one part of finding the missing children and often can't provide the answers that survivors are looking for. There are a number of existing barriers. We know that the time that this takes, the scope and scale of the landscapes we're dealing with are really challenging. We need more coordination, which I hope that webinars such as this can help support. There remains a huge issue with capacity in that there just aren't yet enough people around the country with the experience to do this in a good way. So we want to build more training. It's really important to consider communication. Within your community, within all the survivors from a particular school. We know there's not one school, one community. There's a lot of communities impacted by any location. So having a clear sense of how to communicate with survivors, with community, and with the media is really important. And there remain barriers to access. We know if there's lands in private hands that need to be searched, they're not always accessible to communities. And so that is also an ongoing barrier. So the final slide that I have just to kind of wrap up is that anytime you bring technology out to do a search, it automatically brings up a lot of emotions and trauma for the community. So making sure survivor and community supports are in place, making sure ceremonies and protocols are determined, including as much as possible for the search teams themselves. As someone who's spent a lot of time doing searches, it's really, really hard, and we often need ceremony too. Develop those communication plans during and after the search so that there's a clear sense of how information travels. Clarify expectations, knowing that these technologies can't provide certainty of a particular location being a grave, but that they are useful for narrowing down areas is important. And then making sure that there's clear data agreements, especially with third parties, around what happens to the information when it's gathered, because we need to uphold Indigenous data sovereignty. So that's my perspectives as someone who's done searches at 8 schools over the past 2 years and has worked with over 40 nations and helping them plan these things. And then I'm happy to address any questions that might be related to this. Hi, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kisha Supernant. I would like to remind folks that we are going to have an opportunity for questions at the end, but of course please write your questions in the chat at any point throughout this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. It was brought to my attention that some users are having trouble staying connected here on this webinar. This appears to be limited to cell phones and tablets. Please accept our apologies for this. My only suggestion is that if you aren't on Wi-Fi, you could try connecting to that, and then alternatively, the recording of this webinar will be available on the website afterwards. So I would now like to invite our second speaker, Charlene, to take us away here.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you to Terri Brown first for the opening prayer and for the minute of silence. My name is Charlene Belleau. I'm from Eskedem First Nation from Alkali Lake. It's better known as Alkali Lake. We enjoy about 45 years of sobriety. The root causes of the alcoholism and the challenges we faced over the last 150 years has come from residential school. So resolving our residential school abuse and violence has been really critical to the healthy recovery of our community. The other thing that wasn't mentioned in my introduction and probably just missed, separate from my work with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations with the province, I am a part of the St. Joseph's Mission team. I'm not going to take up a lot of time in my presentation because Whitney, my colleague, has a presentation from the Williams Lake First Nation and on the work we're doing with St. Joseph's Mission investigation. In terms of the work with the province of BC, we are currently coordinating and collaborating between 21 institutions, 18 Indian residential schools, and 3 Indian hospitals. And for many of you across the country, you may have been associated with Indian hospitals where children are sent away from the residential school to the hospitals. This is a BC approach where we've brought all 21 community leads together to be able to coordinate our efforts, share best practices, and be able to work together within the province of BC. It's been important for us to support one another, to hold one another up, to share best practices again between each other. It includes our efforts to make sure that while we have major announcements and disclosures of reflections, that we let each other know and we prepare each other within the province so that it's just not a shock when someone makes an announcement. For example, Williams Lake First Nation just did an announcement on January 25th. Port Alberni will go next week on February 21st, and then we expect other communities to follow with announcements after then. It's in our best interest to make sure that our communities and our nations are prepared with the health supports required, because every time anything hits the news about reflections, it triggers our people, and we always need to be prepared. I was thinking of just my own comments around the most important advice that I have for other communities. I've been working on residential school for about the last 35 years, and you know, what I feel good about today is that while we do this work, we always knew that our children were missing. We knew, though, that nobody heard us back, 15, 20 years ago. The important thing is that we hear each other now, and we're going to help each other through this hard time. I think it's important to give our people, inspiration about how much stronger we can be after all of this is done. We need to continue to just work together and help each other out through the healing. I know that we can do this work as Indigenous people, and even as survivors that may not have had the opportunity for an education to do this work. But our ancestors saw that we would go through this period of time in our history and gave us medicines to make sure that we can do this work. This vision came to one of our elders that was in a fasting ceremony a few years ago and gave us a second stick and a ceremony to continue to do this healing work. Just in terms of again, some of the more important things for me is that every step of the way, whether it's the technology, whether it's the engagement, whatever, I want to view everything as a healing process. So even if the technology, the GPR, the drones, all of the things that are mentioned and that Whitney will go through as well, there's healing in it. I don't need to understand what GPR is. I just need to know that machine is doing some work to find my grandpa. The research is healing. When I look and see things in black and white about our people, to me, that's a healing process. The pictures that we share between each other and that they're bringing to us in the interviews with survivors, that's a healing process. The governments and churches, as frustrated as we get with them with a lack of information from them, that's a healing process because we don't want the governments and churches to control our lives forever. So to me, reconnecting survivors after 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years is really important. When they get to meet their friends and colleagues again, it's really a good feeling when they come together as much as there might be pain, there is a lot of healing in that. Just a couple of other items in terms of key lessons learned just from myself. I believe I don't have to be an expert. I work with Whitney where she is the expert. She is the archaeologist. She knows what she's doing. We have access to other experts. So it's not my job to need to be an expert. I just need to know as a survivor that our children went missing. We know where. They will find them. We will have ceremony. We will guide the process through traditions and ceremony. Again, I think a key lesson learned just in the brief 2 years that we've been doing this work with Williams Lake First Nation is that time is of the essence. Our survivors are getting older. If we are to work towards eventual exhuming, we need DNA from elders that are still alive today if we're going to match, all the way back to my grandpa in my case, for example. So time is of the essence for some of this work. Go slowly, but we need to get the work done. In terms of how would I do things differently, I don't want to rely on governments or churches, for everything. At the same time, they've got the records, so we just need to be able to get that research together. In terms of doing things differently, it feels like that we're taking our people through ups and downs of different traumas, where if we had a holistic approach to what our people have been through from childhood through to ourselves as elders, it would be to make sure that we link a lot of our work to the 60s scoop and the children that were taken away, the day schools where the children were again abused in day schools, murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, the times back at the residential school, or the violence and abuse in our own homes, that drives our people away from our communities, the incarcerated. There's so much pain and trauma, and certainly searching for our children that went missing is trauma again that we're facing. So it would be to link everything and try and find a comprehensive approach to several generations of work that we're going to have to do for our people. We shouldn't be surprised that our death rates, our drug and alcohol rates are very high because our people are going through a lot of trauma. At the same time, I want us to feel good and know, again, that we are going to do what we need to make sure that we resolve 150 years of residential schools and be able to look at our grandchildren, years from now, knowing that they don't have to go through anything that we did. I went 4 years to residential school, and that was enough for me. So I fully support each and every one of you that are online. Great for doing the work. We're here to stand with you. And again, Kukdookaa, just from myself as one part of the panel. And I'll turn it over to Whitney, or you can introduce Whitney, and I'm a part of that team as well. Kukdookaa.
Thank you so much. That was so informative and a lot of good reminders there about this kind of work. Yes, I will invite Whitney, please, to join us.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Whitney Spearing. I am a project manager and lead investigator for the St. Joseph's Mission Residential School Investigation. I work directly with Charlene as well as a team in Williams Lake, and I'm involved in the research, survivor interviews, and also the ground searches that are happening at that site. I am of settler background. I am not an Indigenous person, but I have been very welcomed on the territory in Williams Lake by the Secwepemc people here. So Kukdookaa for having me. I wonder, am I supposed to put my presentation up, or does that happen in the background? I'm just not sure here.
We can do it for you, Whitney.
That would be great. That would be great. I do have it here, but that would be awesome. Thanks. I think that was Andrew. I recognize your voice. Is it showing now? Oh, there it is. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so again, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Charlene said, I am working with the team in Williams Lake to do the ground search. I don't necessarily consider myself to be an expert in any one thing, but as we've moved through this investigation, I've become a little bit more in tune with all of the things that are happening in the technology world. So next slide. Or can I click a button? Nope, you do it. Okay. Just a brief agenda. I wanted to touch briefly on cultural health and wellness, the response objectives of WLFN in looking at St. Joseph's Mission Residential School, and the 3 questions. So community advice in terms of ground searches, a historic and modern property overview of the St. Joseph's Mission, our preliminary investigation, sort of the stages that we've gone through up until this time, the NCTR questions, those 3 questions that were posed that most folks have touched on here, and a path forward. Next. So WLFN recognizes there are First Nations processes and protocols for doing this investigative work that must be adhered to out of respect for the disappeared and deceased children's families. The investigation team has ensured that all team members, staff, and consultants are informed about Indian residential schools and that they engage in ceremony for the safety and well-being of survivors and their families. So this is something that I've heard echoed across this panel, across many different folks that I've spoken to, and as extremely important as everybody moves through these types of investigations that there are health and wellness supports in place, and also cultural awareness and sensitivity, and as well ceremony. Next. So this is Orange Shirt Day. Ceremony in 2021 at WLFN Powwow Arbor. I just wanted to, I really enjoy this photo. These are 3 very powerful women from Williams Lake First Nation, and that day in particular was the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. There was a gathering at the WLFN Powwow Arbor, but there was also like a convoy of folks from the St. Joseph's Mission over to that site. The convoy was almost a kilometer long in some places. So really just the support for Indigenous people as we move through these investigations is very high. And just wanted to share sort of the powerful nature of the ceremony that we had that day. Next. So response objectives for WLFN, engaging local, legal, and technical experts to develop, implement, and document a culturally appropriate community-based response and search for missing and deceased children at the St. Joseph's Mission, assertion of authority for all work related to the St. Joseph's Mission investigation, facilitation of a culturally appropriate community-based inquiry into the SJM, and utilizing the profile of the investigation to educate all Canadians about the reality of residential schools and the impact they have had on Indigenous people. Next. So community advice. I wanted to start with this question early. I'm not really in the business of giving advice. If there was one thing that I could say about the entirety of the investigation to this time, it's go big early. This is a statement that we use in Search and Rescue and in Emergency Management BC, both groups that I'm also involved in on the side in my spare time. So I'm a member of the Central Caribou Search and Rescue team in Williams Lake. This has to do with a lot of different things. This has to do with the application of resources. It has to do with the application of speaking with people and getting resources on the ground. So when we say go big early, it means deploy all of the resources that you have all the conversations that you need to have right at the very forefront. There's always an opportunity to scale back. If you find that there's a piece of technology or a certain technique that's not going to work for you, you don't necessarily have to use it, but better to have a full understanding of the suite of technology and tools available to the community before you engage in the search than be finding out down the road. So that's what this is intended to mean. Next. So a bit of a historic overview of the mission, and it ties back into this Go Big Early statement. The mission was operated for just about 100 years. It's a massive land base. almost just about 520 hectares of land in the San Jose River Valley. There is an operating ranch called the Onward Ranch that was added to the holdings of the Oblates in 1964, as well as it housed mission staff. That's in addition to the residential school proper, as well as several barns and outbuildings that were on that property as well too. Next. So this is a picture in the late 1800s of what the mission looked like. You can see to the right of the photograph there is a cemetery there, as well as a bunch of different buildings, including a convent for the nuns, several priests and boys' dormitories, and one barn that's sort of in the mid-center of the photo. But this is just a snap to show what the landscape looked like at that time and what the buildings were on site at that time. Next. So key lessons learned. One of the key lessons that I have learned in particular are site conditions are ever changing and will dictate a lot of what can be accomplished through ground searching. This is something that definitely Dr. Kisha talked about in her presentation just now, as well I'm sure Dr. Martindale will speak to as well. The conditions on site are going to dictate what type of technologies can be used. Certainly you could use all of them, but they may not be as effective. So having an understanding about how your site conditions play into the actual search that's going on the ground has been key. Like I said, the landscape at St. Joseph's Mission is a massive land base, 520 hectares, and we have a variety of different site conditions. We have open desert, we have agricultural range, we have the industrial school proper where there's a lot of buildings, a lot of infrastructure, as well as some forested areas, definitely some bedrock outcroppings, which are, geological considerations, and in amongst all of that, also a railway that runs right through it. So lots of different considerations when you're talking about what technologies to use or how you're going to approach your ground search at a site. Next. So this is the historic property overview. There's dozens of buildings associated with the operation of St. Joseph's Mission. Definitely at this point, we've mapped just about 82 of them. They vary in age, several barns, dormitories, residences, outbuildings, and a historic cemetery. So the history and presence of the buildings has led to the need for more complex and involved fieldwork and geophysical methods. And what I mean by this, and one example that I can touch on right away is there was utility service tunnel connecting a boiler room to the residential school proper. So through our survivor interviews, many people have talked about that tunnel. Many people have talked about the incinerators and the boiler rooms that were attached to those infrastructures. But finding that piece of infrastructure in the ground has been a challenge. The residential school proper has been demolished on site, so the actual physical building is gone. And we were able to identify where the tunnel is through GPR and magnetometry, which is great. But the second consideration of that is, okay, we know where it is now, but how are we going to approach the search of that tunnel? It's a confined space, it's a closed environment, certainly it's contaminated, and definitely there's minimal oxygen in it. So understanding the complexity of just that one piece of infrastructure has led us to use different techniques to sort of get into that tunnel. Next. This is another picture. So this is actually not 1965. I'll have to relabel that. It probably is in the 1940s. Two of the buildings that stood on the site, the priest dorm as well as the boys dorm, these two buildings burnt down. So this is another complexity that we're dealing with. So those would have been two of the main buildings at this time. When they burnt down, it necessitated building another school on the site, and was basically removed or demolished. But trying to identify where this particular building may have stood and any potential remains that may have been associated with that building is complicated. There's been a lot of infrastructure up and down on the site, many buildings and areas of clearing, so it's taken a minute to try and find it. One of the approaches that we have used to identify where it is historical aerial imagery. And so we've talked a lot about modern aerial imagery in terms of the multispectral photography or the high resolution aerial. Dr. Kisha talked about the LiDAR, which I'll touch on later as well too. But using historic air photos, we've been able to map out buildings that were on site that may not be in any of the other records, including these two buildings. Next. So this is the residential school that was built in the 1950s. This is a photo from 1965. So you can see sort of in the forefront, there's a gravel road. The tunnel that I was speaking about previously is located underneath this road. So if you can imagine, now the school doesn't exist. But this has been one of the most informative photos that we've used for survivor interviews. It does show the entire building, and people are able to sort of point to, you know, where they were housed when they were living at the residential school, where potential areas where children were abused are located, and survivors are able to give us a full rundown of sort of what all of the layers of the building were, the interior of the building, as well as the outside structure. So I would just say it's important to identify the structure for the ground searches, but when you're also taking in survivor knowledge, to have photos like this where you can say, you know, were you on the second floor, what was on the first floor, and be able to take in that data as well too, it has been very important. Next. So 3 main components in the research that we've been doing: archival and photographic research, the survivor interviews, which I just touched on, and the geophysical investigation, which is predominantly what we're talking about today, the ground searching. Sorry, next. Yep. This is a shot of the modern property. So in terms of site conditions and talking about the lessons learned, the grass in this photo is just about up to my waist, about 5'8", so that's about 3 feet of grass across the entire site. So one of the very first considerations was, how do we literally, you know, remove the grass, find any debris or any obstructions that are underneath so that we can run the GPR, run the magnetometry. Double down on that consideration. This is also a privately owned area, and it is the hay for their agricultural operation. And so the replacement of that hay and supplementing those ranchers in order to make sure that they allowed for us to take it down was another consideration. St. Joseph's Mission is one of the only residential schools that's located entirely on private property in Canada, so that has been a substantial navigation that we've had to undertake as well. Next. So the archival and photographic research, I'll just touch on briefly. These are some of the institutions that we've been looking for records at. We've had a chance to attend the BC Provincial Archives on several occasions, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate Archive in Deschales, Montreal, as well as some local institutions. NCTR has also been key in giving us some information about children who are on the memorial register. But I will say that we definitely have not seen the full breadth of records that are available. And as we go through this research, there are more and more records that have come available to us, specifically local residents and community members. So as people are hearing about the announcements that we're making, they're hearing about the research that's happening, they are literally coming into the office with photographs, albums of material that they may have scrapbooked over the years, and some of those, if not all of them, are not available at any of the national institutions. So these are also very critical. So I would say when you're doing or planning for your ground search, do take time to touch base with your, local kind of Joe Blow historian who is maybe not an Indigenous person, but has written newspaper articles throughout the years or has been very involved in a local historical society. Many people have just sort of stepped in off the street to give all of the information that they have. And there's been some critical pieces in there as well. Next. So this is an example of photographic archives that have been used to inform fieldwork. This is one of the only photographs we have from this particular angle looking down the valley. So there are several really good and clear photographs of the mission at this time, but it also involves getting different angles. Survivors will, when they're doing interviews, look at a photograph and say, well, it was right behind this building, or don't you have a view from this side or this side? So just because we have a collection of materials doesn't necessarily mean we have a full understanding or visual representation of everything that was out on site. So the more we can take in, the more we can sort of mirror that back to survivors when they're doing their interviews. Next. This is an example of photographic archives, or not, actually this is not, well, it is a photograph because I took a photograph of a construction plan. This is a construction plan. And so there are minimal site plans of the residential school prior to the 1950s when the new building was built. However, this hatched outline was actually on a construction plan for the new buildings, and the hatched outline is the old footprint of a different building, and how this proposed assembly hall would be built over top of what used to be the laundry building. So these pieces are, I can't even say how critical they are to informing your GPR work, informing the magnetometry work, any sort of remote sensing or ground sensing or LiDAR. Having this knowledge and these drawings is really critical. Next. So sorry, just to even say, like, that is just a fragment. I really do want to make sure that people understand this. This is just really a fragment of information that was tucked into a file at the RBCM. And it took Charlene and I going down there, spending a week in the archives and piecing through every single piece of paper that we were allowed to see at that time. And it was just kind of tucked in there. Nobody had really flagged it. It didn't seem of importance, but then there it was. And we have now an understanding of that specific slice of the property. So. And this slide speaks exactly to that. The objective of the geophysical investigation is to do the detailed survey inside the investigation area. But given the extensive historical use, the geophysical investigation is extremely complex. So there's networks of utilities, abandoned infrastructure, building remnants, debris all over the place, as well it is an operating ranch. So you can imagine the amount of metal that is just in the ground by way of old tractors. Different pieces of agricultural equipment over the years. Next. So the survivor interview process and public interviews. I did touch on this briefly, but essentially the SJM team set up an email at the very beginning so that people could reach out to our team and schedule a survivor interview. We've also had several non-Indigenous folks, non-survivors, who have come forward and said, I would like to give an interview because I have specific information. And one that I can speak to directly is a couple who've actually lived in Williams Lake their entire life, and they have a family member who's buried in the historic cemetery. So year after year, they actually attended the site. And were there as the grounds changed, and they were able to relay back to us, oh no, definitely, in the 50s the fence was painted, or the Virgin Mary was moved over here. They have sort of a different outlook on what was happening at the site. And I will say too, because they were adults, the retention of information, and certainly they were not in survival mode. They were not in a traumatized state. They were just people who were attending the site. They were able to give really detailed information about the cemetery in particular, and that's been key in identifying sort of hotspots that I've put here to really focus the geophysical and archaeological searches. Next. So this is a map showing the scope of the SJM investigation area. So the purple outline is, like I said, just about 520 hectares. The orange outline is our most recent phase, so phase 2. As Charlene said, we did make an announcement on the 25th of January detailing an additional 66 reflections that are indicative of potential graves in that area. So we now have 66 plus the 93 original. This is really just to show the environmental scope of what we're looking at. It's hard to see, but there's multiple lakes, the San Jose River, the CN right-of-way, which was, Pacific Great Eastern and then BC Rail, 2 ranches, as well as the mission itself. Next. So the geophysical methods that we have been using at the mission include the aerial light imaging range detection, so LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR, which is a sort of a side scanning LiDAR, low flight, high resolution aerial imagery, magnetometry, magnetic susceptibility, ground penetrating radar, and archaeological field reconnaissance. So I just want to say that we are using the term archaeological field reconnaissance because that is what it is akin to. However, we're very much of the professional opinion that this is not an archaeological investigation. I am an archaeologist, but this is a product of genocide. This is not something that the provincial authorities should be involved in terms of archaeology. However, that being said, and I've heard several people touch on it in the past couple of weeks, many of these sites were also built on top of pre-existing sites. So they were areas where folks had lived and areas of habitation. So it is a consideration, but definitely the remains themselves are not archaeological. So combining these techniques is able to give us a comprehensive overview of the site. This is a snapshot of the LiDAR looking down at the mission. So you can see a combination of the buildings, some roads. Definitely you can see also a slice in the left-hand corner of the CN right-of-way. That's the railway, and as well the sort of the natural features. So the river, all of the oxbows in the middle there, that is the river itself in the San Jose River Valley. This LiDAR was taken specifically to try and identify roads. One of the things that we discussed very early on was that in order to, and just to be quite frank, and in order to move bodies, you would need access and roads. And so there were survivor accounts that talked about, the ability of students to see children being buried potentially across, what they said was across the tracks. So across the tracks from the mission. And so by using the LiDAR, we were able to identify some of the old road bases, like the old ranch roads that were in place. They're no longer visible to the naked eye. The grass obviously is very high and the land has been tilled, but because they were so compacted from use, they are still visible on the LiDAR. So one of the roads themselves that we followed then took us to the historic site of the bridge that actually crossed the San Jose River. So we now have an intact trajectory from the mission over to the railway, and so we know potentially where movement would have been. Next. This is an example of terrestrial LiDAR, so scanning of the buildings. This is not a building that's at the mission, but just an example of what can be done with it. Certainly 3D building recreation is one thing that's on top of mind as we move forward with the investigation, and especially with the legacy pieces, being able to have sort of a virtual museum setting where survivors can sort of enter the building and give information about specific rooms. Definitely we're aware that through Library and Archives Canada there are construction, design draws for construction, AutoCAD and all of those things. So recreating the buildings is certainly something that we're looking at doing as well. Next. This is just a picture of the GPR equipment at the site. This is the very first day that we had equipment out on site, and so you can see it's a multi-channel. Because of the large size of the mission and the scope of the investigation, this is actually now attached to like a quad or UTV, a little Ranger, and so we're doing as much as we possibly can to do large swaths of area where it's open field. It is not all open field. You can definitely see in the background of that photo the forested area, and that forms a part of the phase 2 and certainly phase 3 areas that we'll be looking at later this year. Next. think we can probably skip this one. This is just an example of some known graves and what the hyperbola look like when you're using the GPR. I think more informed people are going to talk about the GPR later. I just put this in. Next. This is an example. This is actually a detailed map of the GPR grids that were done at the mission. So just taking a look at what the results potentially could look like when communities are getting back the results of a ground search. It is done in grids often, and so that doesn't necessarily conform to what's out on site. You know, we had sort of a dish-shaped area that needed to be searched, but fitting all of the squares into that is what it looks like in the end. Next. This is an example of magnetometry and one that I like to show. This is an archaeological site at Bridge River. This is a pit house village, but they did use magnetometry on it. Next slide. Actually, go to the next one too, Andrew. Thanks. Okay, and so this is a magnetometry view of that same site. So you can see all of the kikwilis or the subsurface houses there, but you're able to actually see the ring of each individual pit house, and in the center also a red dot, which it indicates the hearth or the fireplace is inside. So you can imagine the application of this to disturbed ground, also where there may be areas of burning on site at the schools or the mission, when we're looking for areas that were intensely burned, like where the incinerators may have sat. The magnetometry has been important for that work. Next. And this is what the magnetometry grids look like. So you can see the difference between the pink and the blue grids. The shapes aren't necessarily the same, but they more or less line up with the area. So just again, just taking a look sort of on the inside of the report that we get back when we've completed a portion of the search, this is one of the physical maps that come back. This is an aerial view of the cemetery at St. Joseph's Mission. I don't know if you remember, just at the beginning of the presentation, there was a very old photo that showed the cemetery. One of the key things about the cemetery is it did change shape and size over time. So in the first photo that I showed, it was much larger. This is the modern footprint in 2021, and you can see the nature of the differences. So doing that really detailed mapping inside the cemetery has been a key focus. Phase 1 and also Phase 2, we did more detailed work this year to sort of gain a better understanding of what may be present in the cemetery. It is complicated. The interment register only goes back to the 1930s, but the cemetery existed in the 1800s. So definitely there's a lot of information missing. One thing that we do know for certain is that there are several students at a minimum who did perish at the mission, who are interned in this cemetery, or they are registered that way. And certainly none of the markers in the cemetery indicate where they are. So all of that to say, we know with as much knowing as we can possibly have, as much certainty as we can have at this point, that there are several students who died at the mission buried in unmarked graves in this cemetery or just outside of it. Next. This is just to talk about the Phase 2 investigation area, most of which I've touched on. The only thing that I will say is definitely it's very large in scope as well too. So the 520 hectares has been broken into multiple phases. Phase 2 is still 130 hectares of land, so still a very large swath to be completed. Next. And that is the shape of the Phase 2 area. So just taking a look at what it encompasses, the black line that runs through it is the CN right-of-way. Next. So this was the last question. I'm always of a dual mind on some of these things. So would we do anything differently? Would I go all the way back to the beginning and start over and do things differently? Yes and no. Yes, if we had records in advance of the search, we definitely would have used them to inform the ground search more thoroughly. That being said, like the examples that I showed of construction drawings and utilities infrastructure that are in the ground at the mission, that are in records at the RBCM. If I had if they were in hand at our team, but prior to advancing the GPR, absolutely, I would go back and change that. But the reality is, we didn't know that they were housed there. We hadn't seen them yet. And so I say no also. No, we wouldn't have done anything differently because there will always be unknowns. There are always going to be unknowns. Even going into our third phase of work this year, we still have massive unknowns. But delaying the search on the basis of waiting for records, which may take years, is not in the best interest of the community or families. And certainly, to speak to what Charlene touched on, is like time is of the essence, especially when we're talking about things like DNA, but definitely in terms of advancing the work. We could wait another 150 years and the government would not be able to produce all of the records that we need to start doing the ground searches. But it's not in our best interest to do that. It's in our best interest to, at a minimum, advance some of the work to the best of our ability and to the best of our knowing in this moment, and sort of get the ball rolling. And from there, I've found that it is kind of a snowball approach. It's the avalanche approach. As we start moving, we start to pick up steam. As we start to talk to people in community, they say, oh, I have a story to tell, but also I do remember seeing these 3 people who you might also want to talk to. Or just through networking and going to multiple events that NAC has put on, and also the interlocutor's office, networking with folks there to say like, oh, have you considered this piece of technology, or have you been in touch with this person? So getting the ball rolling is often what will keep the momentum going forward. So I think the short answer is no. I don't think we would have done anything differently. We could have had more information, or we could have had more technology, but advancing the work and sort of getting things moving was the most important thing in the moment. So I think that's my last slide. I'm not sure, Andrew, but you can tell me. I really appreciate everybody's time this morning. And hopefully that wasn't too long-winded, but definitely if there's any questions, I know we're going to take some time for that. But if folks are wanting to reach out, please do contact our team directly. We're always willing to sit down and talk specifics, with other nations about what work they're doing or what they might employ as well too. So, Kukdookaa, thank you.
Thank you so much, Whitney. That was just excellent. Now our next presenters, before I get to that, I do just want to say that apparently we're still having problems streaming the webinar for phone users. Nothing is working for us yet. So apologies, we are trying to resolve those problems. Again, this will be posted online afterwards for public viewing. Okay, so next is going to be Terrence and Barbara. I'm not sure if Barbara was able to get online or not. Are you there, Barbara?
Yes, I got on just a few minutes ago.
Excellent. Well, welcome. And I'm not sure if you and Terrence are going to co-present or if you're going to individually present.
Barb, why don't you get it started and I'll jump in. I have some notes. I don't have a formal presentation at all, yeah, let's just go with Barb.
Okay. You're very quiet, Terrence. I'm just wondering if maybe you could make an adjustment to your audio, but in the meantime, I will turn the floor over to Barbara and Terrence for their presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Barb Lavallee. I'm lead research for Marival IRS. We started GPR back in 2019, and because of COVID, we put a delay on it and carried on June 2021. We did work with Sask Polytech We did a area 40,000 square feet. It's a cemetery, a known cemetery of the Catholic Church. And at one point, and I believe in 1962, a priest bulldozed over all the headstones, and everybody lost track of who was buried where. So that was our main focus, and our end goal was to determine, other than the documented burials, all of the undocumented, unmarked student burials. As we get into the NCTR data bank, we have come upon a lot of documents that have increased the amount of deaths at the school. And now the big question is, where are they? Where were they buried? Were they buried? I caught the very tail end of Whitney's presentation, and we have a lot of different forms of them burying the students, and one of them was stacked burials, meaning they would burn the previous burial, put another one on there. We have an eyewitness account of that. So we have a lot of work that we're looking for. We're looking into the cadaver dog to see if we can train them to pick up human scent from ashes. We haven't got anything in concrete writing from them yet. They are looking into it, and it may take about 6 months to train those dogs. So that's another tool to science that we'll be certainly looking into. With the GPR, we did have 751 anomalies that were consistent with burial. We numbered them 1s, 2s, and 3s. 1s were an absolute. The consistency of the ground disturbance was there, and we classified that as a 1. 2s, we were able to observe. There is some consistency with the ground disturbance that would tell us that there is a burial here. Through other ground disturbance, we were still somewhat able to identify. And the 3s, there is a good possibility there was a burial, but there was just too much other ground disturbance, and that one, it could have, we couldn't have provided any scientific proof that it actually was a burial. So the 3s we eliminated and went with the 1s and 2s. Sask Polytech had done that for us, and then Dr. Clark had come in with U of S and is working in conjunction with Dr. Abdul from Sask Polytech. They're working together. We put both our data, our groundwork from the GPR, and look at the possibility of comparison through layering using different programs, filters, and I'm very excited to hear from Dr. Clark because he's our expert here. And other than that, we did do some areas that we didn't include in the 751. And we found one area that was very busy. And I leave the rest up to Dr. Clark to comment on that. Other than that, I'm wide open to questions and suggestions. So if you like, Dr. Clark, you can go from here.
Hi, Terrence, are you there? Oh, I can see you. Okay. No rush.
Maybe while we're waiting on Dr. Clark, I would like to also present that we explored various approaches with the GPR. We we were quite comfortable with the archaeology approach, because Sask Polytech, they did use somewhat of an engineering approach, and then we did have a third-party consultation with an engineering approach. With the GPR data collection, the engineers done great. They were able to gather the data. With the archaeology departments, their identification of the anomalies consistent with burial and the advanced technology with their programs and filters, and the lengthy experience of doing this work, we felt the comfort zone to go with the archaeology teams from the university to do the analysis for us. So I just thought that I would like to comment, and I very much appreciated all the work from the engineers in gathering the data. So that's open to others, their choices, their discretion, and I thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, now I don't see Terrence on the call anymore, but I could be overlooking something. So we will give him a minute to join again. So I am going to go to Andrew Martindale. Are you there, Andrew? Please feel free to start your presentation.
Hi, thank Crystal. Yes, I'm here. Just give me a second. Apologies. Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be among you today. My name is Andrew Martindale. I'm a settler Canadian, and I work and live in the ancestral, unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam people, with whom I've done a lot of work on this important issue. I'd like to start just by thanking Terri for the opening prayer to set us off in an important and good way. And also, I'd like to acknowledge all the survivors here and elsewhere, and all of you for the work that you're doing, taking this heavy task upon yourselves. There's a lot of information that's available and that's coming at you through these kinds of services, and I just wanted to observe that there's a great deal to process, but we're here to help and to provide you with guidance and pathways. But we're also here to benefit from the understanding and the experiences of peer communities who have taken on this task. And I think we've heard from two today, others through Kisha, and that's a really important avenue for connection and for understanding. Communities are at different places in this work, and they'll take different paths. There's no singular route that everybody must follow. And so these kinds of relationships, finding best practices, having conversations, advancing our understanding, and helping each other through the peer network, I think are really important things to keep in mind and to develop as we take on this work ahead. The conversations about work on ground searches can quickly move into technical details, which can, I think, be overwhelming. And I just want to acknowledge that there's different ways that we can explore this work. Sometimes we need a preliminary view. Sometimes we need something a little bit more robust for decision making and among leadership. And sometimes we need to get into the really technical details of particular pieces of this field work, of this groundwork. All of those are parts of our collective effort to bring together. So depending on where you are in the process, we hope to have resources for you. They are available, and or they're emerging. And if you're just starting, it can be, I think, quite a daunting task. But we're here to reassure you that there are resources available.
Can people hear me now? Is this finally working?
It is. I was doing a little pinch hitting for you, Terri, at the beginning, but I can pause and turn it back to you, and I can pick up my thoughts after you're done. I'm not sure if Terri can hear me.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. We were able to hear you, Terri.
Is this working?
Terri, it is working. Andrew had stepped in for a few moments, so would you like to present now, or would you like to wait until Andrew is finished?
It really doesn't matter. If Andrew's on a roll, he can keep.
No, I think I'm at a good point to take a pause, and I think you should complete the thought following along on from Barbara's work.
Take it away, Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Go ahead, Terri.
Oh, is it going to be me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. One of the things I was going to point out was that technology has its problems, and I was actually going to make fun of Barb for not being able to get online. And then it's my microphone. So just to kind of go over some of the things, and all of the presenters have provided excellent feedback so far. I think when you're planning your searches, really think about that this is much bigger than GPR, that this is going to involve all manner of research aspects as well as community and ceremonial aspects. So try to think holistically, incorporate ceremony from the very beginning, think about health and wellness supports. These need to happen now before you're even doing your search. When your community members are hearing about other searches, this is a very difficult time for everyone, for survivors and their families. And so planning long-term for health and wellness, that's going to start before the project, during the project, and then well after the project finishes. Think about other community supports. We've heard about the importance of background research, archives, finding maps, photos. These are all important. And as Whitney said, you don't necessarily have to wait to get them all. Some of them are very difficult to get. And some of them are going to need to be translated. A lot of the Oblate records are going to be in French. And so that's something you're going to have to deal with and be aware of. One thing that we found really productive is having an open house early in the process to talk about planning, to hear the concerns from the community, and really importantly to address the limitations of the technologies. I know that Andrew has already talked about this, or will. The GPR is not magic. It's not the way that you see it on TV. It cannot find graves in many different contexts. And so don't overpromise to your community. And if companies come in and say that their GPR can find all of the graves, they're lying to you, and you should be very wary of that. I think the phased approach is the best. The GPR results are not immediate, although we do have a screen in front of us. It doesn't necessarily tell us exactly whether or not we're standing on a grave or not. We really need to do processing and analysis and combine many of these GPR lines, radargrams together to really see what's there. And so jumping into a huge project that you're doing many acres at once, it's probably not the best approach. I would recommend doing something smaller, sampling it, processing it, analyzing it. As Kisha said, soils are different. The historic level of disturbance is different. So just make sure that the GPR is giving you what you want, especially if you're paying a lot of money from an outside company. Make sure that they do some testing first so that you're comfortable with the results that you're getting. Think about complementary approaches. Barb mentioned cadaver dogs. I think that this is a great underutilized resource. Kisha talked about all of the other things, and so did Whitney, the other geomagnetic searches. And it looks like there'll be a couple other technologies come online soon that might help us in confirming the presence of these burials. One thing that I think is really important and that Barb and her team have done perfectly, and that's to bring together a knowledgeable team, that no one of us could do this entire project. It's too big. We are not experts in archives or in maps or in GIS or in GPR or in health and wellness or ceremony. And so bringing together all of the experts that you need and focus on building capacity in community whenever humanly possible. I see this as a generational opportunity when the federal government is doling out tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to develop skills in your own community. And if there's any way that you can keep some of that money in-house and not spend it on engineering firms or research firms or other experts, try to build whenever possible in your own community. Obviously, that's not always possible, and so we do have to rely on some of these outside firms. One thing that I think is increasingly important is controlling the narrative, and Kisha did talk about this. This is understanding a comprehensive media strategy. Think about community outreach, both to your survivors, but also to survivors from other First Nations that attended your school. They're often not part of the conversation, and they can often be shocked by press conferences about the school that they attended. Talk to the broader community as well. Get everyone ready to know that something is going to be announced or that the work is going to get started. Get prepared for the media onslaught. It's kind of a meat grinder, honestly, and it's really difficult. And so the more prep you do to get ready, to have all of your FAQs ready, your expert team can provide you these. And so think through all of the questions that the media might ask and be ready for them. And if possible, have your experts there. And so if there's a question about translation, you've got your translator there who can just say it immediately, and you're never out on a limb. There's never an opportunity to slide a wedge in and make it seem like the community is of a different opinion, or that there's that you're not all on the same page. When it's your project, you decide what page everyone's on, and then you can control that narrative. And also importantly for the communication strategy is know what's next. As soon as you start talking about your searches or start the search itself or publish your results, everyone's going to want to know what you're going to do. Are you going to protect the graves? Are you going to recover them? How are you going to deal with them if they're on private land or if they're on public land? All of these things, you need to have some answers because your community will be demanding for them. And so to think through those and at least have something to say about them, I think is really important. And then lastly, if I were to do anything from the beginning again, honestly, in a perfect world, we would have had all of these discussions years ago. That a lot of the issues that we're having today are completely predictable. In fact, we talked about them and predicted them. The Canadian Archaeological Association Working Group, the NCTR, CERNAC, we were all discussing these for several years and trying to come up with solutions. And I think we went far too slowly. And so when the results from Kamloops came out, everything sped into motion really quickly. Money was released. And unfortunately, I feel like I've heard a number of stories that communities have not got fair value for their money, that they're not happy with the process that they went through. They're not convinced of the results they found. And so this is a great opportunity to talk to other communities. Barb is great. She's got a great way of thinking about things and organizing things. Talk to her, talk to anyone else that's already well engaged in the process. And I think they can offer good advice of the hiccups that have occurred along the way. And then I guess very lastly, it's really important to do this in a good way. I've heard several communities talk about that. From the very beginning, this is a community-driven project. It has to be, although you may bring in outside experts and archaeologists and project managers and whoever, this is your project. There really is no right and wrong, but we're just here to help, and we'll take direction from you and provide any assistance that we can moving forward. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you were able to get on here today. Again, a reminder that if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. We have some time for questions at the end. And I will invite Andrew Martindale back to finish your thoughts.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, everyone. I'd just like to build on some of the comments that we've heard so far today for you to keep in mind as you're developing your plans for this important work. First of all, it's really important to remember that the ground searching, as significant as it is, it doesn't provide truth to this history. We already know this truth. Survivors have provided us with that knowledge. The TRC has recorded it. And the ground search step adds something to the conversation, to the knowledge, but it doesn't add truth. That's already known. And I think that's a very important thing, especially when we hear voices about that are looking at technology as an opportunity to question this history. I think that's very important to keep in mind. Secondly, ground searches, as important as they are, may not be the first step or the step that you. And I think that's entirely appropriate. There are many tasks ahead, and priority for survivors and their supports, their families, and the communities are, I think, the first and most important thing to attend to. As several of the speakers have noted, their knowledge is a priority to support, and their lives and their well-being are the key pieces that we need to attend to first. And that also, I think, involves, as several speakers have said, the importance of ceremony and the importance of doing this in the way that is the best for your community. I'll convey to you information that comes to me from the Musqueam community with whom I work on these issues. They refer to some of our work where we are employing these ground search technologies as seeking and listening to the voices of ancestors who will provide us with insight in our search for missing children. And that is a very important, for me, a very profound way of framing the work that we are doing. And that is relevant to their work. You have your own pathways that I think are really important to develop and to assert. And the assertion not only of the appropriate ways, but also of your jurisdiction over these histories and over these lands and over these ancestors is essential. These are your territories, your places, and your voices and your decisions are paramount in the work ahead. So the ground searches themselves, as you've heard now from several examples, are complicated, and they take a lot of steps, and they involve a number of parts that benefit from some integration. I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of some of these before jumping into some comments on some specific elements. We know that survivors and their knowledge have to be supported but also sought, and that's a component of this work, a central one. Archives, many archives provide resources, and they appear in many places, as several of the speakers have pointed out. And the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is a main national archive. It's not the only one, and it is growing as it seeks out more records. That's an important piece that links in, as Kisha and as Charlene and Whitney have pointed out, to the work that's done in the ground. Because we're working across landscapes, knowing where things are on the land, where they have been, building maps, building databases of maps through technologies like GIS or Geographical Information System, drawing on resources like archival photos and archival drawings. These are all important pieces. Collecting information on the land today through technologies such as drones, LiDAR, and other forms of compiling spatial information, important parts to bring into any ground search so that not only do you know what is available, what is there in the land, and what has been there in the land, but so that you can locate the results of the ground searches that you conduct. If we find information within a search such as ground penetrating radar, it's not sufficient just to say that we know or we think there might be an ancestor represented in the results. We need to go back to the land and know exactly where that information is coming from. So this is an important piece of the work ahead. The ground searching itself, as you've heard, has many different options. Many of us are working with ground penetrating radar, and I'll speak about it briefly in a moment about its reliability and its importance, but it isn't the only technology. And as Terri points out, these are technologies that are evolving. They were not invented for this purpose. New ones are being refined, new methods are being developed, and as we will see in the years ahead, and this work will take us many years, new options will become available to us. And the tasks of bodies such as the National Advisory Committee will be to understand these technologies and provide guidance to communities on their utility as this work progresses. There's also a scholarship that you will all be involved in as you conduct these works. You'll be working with these technologies, but also refining the methods, understanding how they apply to the landscapes that you're working in. And that conversation between communities doing this work, seeking an understanding of how these technologies, their effectiveness in different places, is a really, I think, a useful thing to maintain, a connection rather than just listening to experts providing guidance, which I think plays a role. Listening to your neighbors and your friends across the country, your peers who have experience, their knowledge will help you as well. As the landscapes of this work are very different across the country, not one approach to any of these technologies will necessarily be the one that you will need to explore. So working together is important. This creates, as Terri suggests, the need for an integrated team. There are a lot of people, very few individuals have all of these expertise. So bringing them together in an entity that attends to your needs, that brings the capacity to your community, is an organizational part. And we can see across the country, those communities that are taking these steps, not only are modeling how to employ the technology, but modeling how to organize themselves to do this work effectively. And I think those are inspirational for all of us. The National Advisory Committee and other bodies are compiling this work, providing guidance and examples for you to draw on. It is a work in progress, but I think we'll see that the work ahead will become more coherent as we have conversations further like this. And before I get into the technology, just briefly, I want to mention that there are different models available to you for the kind of work that ground searches involve. You can draw on, as some of our examples show, the work of academics, which I think have a place. We tend to be, I'm an academic, we tend to be working in sort of in the refining of methods. We also tend not to be very quick. There's a slower process to our work because of our commitments and the sort of refinements that we bring. The capacities of the country, I think, necessarily rely on consulting companies, and many of them are doing excellent work. There are caveats, as Terri and Kisha have both pointed out, but I wouldn't dissuade you from consulting with those that have worked very successfully with communities across the country, and they can provide really important services in appropriate ways for you. So the last one, and I think is perhaps the most important, but may or may not be relevant for you, is developing some of these capacities in your own community. Learning the technologies, the techniques, and bringing them within your own team. There are opportunities. We are developing them, and we have developed with Musqueam a preliminary course to train people in ground searches, people from Indigenous communities exclusively. We'll be offering a version of this course in the months ahead, and likely it will not be our last example of it. We're also creating online guidance for others to draw on this resource so they can learn themselves, or they can seek out another experienced individual who can draw on our resources to explore this technology, to bring this work into your own community so that you control all aspects of the work, which is, I think, an important model. So there are different choices that are in front of you, and there is an important consideration about when you should do this work. There is a sense that we should be out searching the land now, and for you that may be the right step, but the land will be there in the years ahead. So the urgency, we are pressing at the national conversation for funding, for long-term funding, and that should not be removed. So my hope is that the urgency that you may feel to get out and do this work on the land can be tempered somewhat. Let me turn lastly to some comments on technology and specifically on the work of ground penetrating radar. It's an important technology. It has had the most, I think, the most public profile of the options that you have. It is a technology that's based on principles of echolocation, of radar, and it looks a lot like navigational radar that we might find in boats or aircraft. It sends out a signal, and then it catches a return. And that reflection tells us about what it's encountered. It's been employed very successfully in what we might call formal cemeteries, places that are planned as locations of ancestors. And this is in part because the landscapes that are chosen for cemeteries typically are fairly easy to dig graves in. and that makes them quite non-reflective to GPR signals. So we have in a cemetery a regular set of shapes of grave shafts, often in ordered patterns, located in a background that doesn't return a signal, so they stand out quite clearly. And that work is both informative and influential on our steps ahead, and there are populations of missing children in formal cemeteries that we need to attend to. But we also know that there are places beyond these kinds of landscapes where missing children might locate. There, of course, are missing children who are not in burials, and radar will not attend to them. So we must think of other places and other options in those cases. For example, underwater, we've heard of some examples. Radar won't work in those contexts nearly as well. So when we move away from these places where radar has worked, we're moving into a little bit of the unknown. And that's where we, I think, benefit from our collective conversations. And I will assure you that these are ongoing. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts or the details of how we interpret radar signals to identify burials for you today, but I will assure you that these conversations are going on, and that the NAC, the National Advisory Committee, is convening a series of meetings with communities who are doing this work, so that we can, those of us who have experience in this difficult step, can share our knowledge and develop collective best practices that may be different depending on what part of the country, what kind of landscape you're working in. So this is one of the more difficult pieces, simply because it hasn't really been done as much as the application of radar to formal cemeteries. So as we move away from those, we'll find that the task ahead will benefit from our scholarship and our collective work. Within cemeteries themselves, the technology works very well. And my recommendation, as Terri suggests, if you're just embarking upon this, is to begin with the known cemeteries. Partly because this is where the ancestors belong. It's an easier place to begin, and partly because the technology we know works well there, and it's a space for you to understand the local conditions that you face, so that you can work beyond this in more difficult frames as you move away from the formal cemeteries into landscapes where missing children might be. We've seen some examples of the Williams Lake equipment, and if you saw in the background, their terrain is very different. It's open grassland in some cases. In places where I tend to work on the coast, it's densely forested, and so different configurations of equipment will be needed for different places. There's no singular path that you can necessarily employ unless you can find people who have landscapes that are similar to yours. And as Charlene points out, at the provincial level in British Columbia, there's a conversation going on between lead communities. And that's a model, I think, that benefits all of us across the country as communities share their knowledge and their understanding with each other. So there are resources available currently online that are available to you on many of these issues, technological issues for ground searches. They exist as summary pages, single pages for guidance for people who are just getting into the conversation about what these are. They exist as more detailed summaries and videos, and there are even more detailed and technical documents that people who are in the midst of this work can reference. These will be updated as we learn more about this landscape and as we employ this technology further. I will place some of these links in the chat after I've done talking. We are, as I say, going to have a series of conversations in the months ahead about refinements of some of these technologies. Our first one will be ground penetrating radar because of its value thus far. It does have a lot of utility for the work ahead, which is why it's being employed. It's not the only choice, but for burials in the ground, it can help. And there is, a refinement that we need to bring to our understanding of whether a particular signal in a particular place is in fact a grave, but that's something that we are improving and advancing as we work collectively. So we live in a bit of a balance between with these technologies, between seeing their value, but also recognizing their limitations. And they do have value. And we've heard some voices of denialism across the country that seek to exploit our refinements of these methods to sort of cast doubt on this history that we know is true. At the same time, we do want to refine the technology so that it can be employed successfully in different places. And there are limits to what it can do but it's not the only option that we have. So I know we want to leave time for conversation and questions. I'll pause at this stage and just finish by saying that there is a value in a national and collective conversation towards best practices, towards common resources that all communities will need. We've heard air photos, for example, a resource that most communities need. We should be able to access them easily. Every community should have an inventory of air photos for the territories and landscapes they're interested in. That's not currently available, but we're pressing for that. Long-term funding is an essential part. Assurances that you don't have to make a decision this month on the work that you face ahead, I think is a necessary piece. We've heard from government officials that that's what they're committed to. We would like to hold them to that commitment, and more reassurances would be even better. We want to expand capacity building so that communities can learn how these technologies are employed in the complex endeavor of ground searches, and if they wish to bring that capacity to their community, that they have opportunities for learning and training so that they can take this knowledge themselves. This is my last slide, is that this is shared work. It's heavy work, and I think it's improved when we work together. Finding missing children is an important part of the work ahead, but it is not the only part of the work ahead. And I'm always cautious that while we move into technology is not the solution for this work. This work is about finding a country that would have existed had it not been for residential schools. It's not just about finding the missing children. And that's something that no technology is going to solve. It will require instead difficult conversations among ourselves as members of this community, and guidance, which I'm indebted to, of the voices of survivors and Indigenous leadership in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and everyone here who has shared their experiences and also their expertise. I've learned a lot today, so a big hi cho. I just want to remind people that the 24-hour National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available to provide support, and you can reach them at 1-866-925-4419. Additionally, anyone here can reach out to Sandra Delaronde, who is a health support worker, if you do need to talk to anyone. We will place this information in the chat, but her phone number is 204-806-0134. So just a reminder that this webinar is hosted by the National Advisory Committee on Residential School Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. You can find a lot of background information on our website, which is www.nac-cnn.ca. And if you have a moment and you have a question, please be sure to place that in the chat so we can get to it. There have been some questions brought forward. One in the chat for Dr. Kisha Supernant, who unfortunately has had to leave our event early today. But if I'm to reframe that question for Kisha to others here who can answer that, I wonder about the differences between the results of a scan versus being able to say that graves have been definitively found. Is that a difference that we're able to bridge, and are you able to provide more information on that? And I will just open that up to anyone, any one of our speakers who would like to turn on their cameras or their microphones.
I can perhaps get us started on that conversation. It is an essential and fundamental issue. Radar and other forms of geophysical technology will point to possibilities and potentials for a grave. In and of itself, it's not 100% And so an additional line of evidence is often required. Survivor testimony, archival records, finding signals within a cemetery are all additional lines of evidence that the signal itself is a grave. And so that distance of uncertainty can be crossed, can be shortened. In some cases, it will never be resolved fully only using these more remote sensing technologies, and communities may want to consider the possibility of exhumation as a way of evaluating these things definitively, these signals, pardon me, definitively. There are some other options, and I know Terri has worked with environmental DNA as a potential pathway, and perhaps he could speak to that. So there's a bit of a space around interpretation that we are all collectively working on, both to refine when we know when a signal is an ancestor, and also to what extent we are confident that that signal or that interpretation is true.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Andrew.
Maybe I could, is this working now? Is it working? I don't know which one.
I can hear you. It's just a little bit faint, but please speak loudly and go ahead.
All right. Sorry about this. It's this computer, I guess, is not enjoying today. There's a few things there, and so as we've talked about, collecting the data, the GPR data, is not overly difficult. It takes some expertise, but it's really the interpretation that is more problematic. And so we advise not really talking and throwing numbers around until the interpretation is completely done, because a skilled interpreter who knows how to interpret GPR data can go through and say, no, I really believe that's a rock. No, I really think that that's a gopher hole, or whatever. And so we can narrow down the number of anomalies to the ones that are highly probable, likely. As Barb said, we kind of have this system of ranking them depending on the number of criteria they have. And so just be cautious of the numbers and jumping on a number. The media loves numbers, and so that's always an issue. But also, as Andrew was saying, that there are other techniques that are coming on board where potentially we can use minimally invasive soil probes to confirm the presence of either human DNA, or using soil spectroscopy, the presence of decomposing remains. And so these are things that we'll be testing this summer. And I think that some communities will want to go down that route of confirming that the graves that we think are there, that we're very sure that are there using GPR and other methods, as Andrew's saying, we layer them. But there may be ways soon to confirm them without necessarily having to do a full excavation. And so that's something that, we'll update you on as soon as we have some results.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And I just want to point to a resource that Andrew Martindale posted in the chat. Here is a useful summary about GPR for those just getting started. And this looks like indigenousscience.ubc.ca website. I'm not sure if that is on the NAC website as a resource, but I'm flagging that in the chat for folks to check out. Okay, so we will move on to another question. Is there any resources available where we could measure different soil types? If so, what is the ideal soil type for this work?
Again, I think I could perhaps get started on that conversation. When we're talking about radar, it does respond differently in different soil types, as do other geophysical methods. With radar specifically, what it's the reflection is capturing is not so much the contents of the grave shaft, but the grave shaft itself. And the grave shaft is this zone of disturbed soil, which acts really as a little bit of a sponge for water. So water is drawn into that soil, becomes somewhat more wetter than the surrounding soil, just because it's been mixed up through the excavation and the redeposition. And so you're really capturing that signal of a little bit of the content, but a lot of it's just the grave shaft. So that means that this works really well in places that have kind of loose fill, and in places where the soil is relatively moist. If we work in extremely dry conditions, it doesn't work as well for this kind of an endeavor. And if we work in really saturated, water saturated conditions, it can also be a bit of a problem. On the West Coast, for example, we're exploring what happens when we do the work at different times of year. Sometimes it can be very wet here, and other times it dries out a little bit more. So these are things that we are still exploring. There are a few issues that we do know. Some things are quite reflective. Big rocks can provide a signal back that sometimes looks like a burial. Tree roots, rodent holes or voids can also appear in the radar. As Terri mentioned, there are ways to sort of identify all of those somewhat separately through experience. So there are ways of kind of interpreting the patterns that are returned to you. One factor about soil types is if there's a lot of clay or salt in the content of the soil, it can create a barrier to the signal from traveling through the soil. So very high clay contents of soils can actually make it not feasible to do the radar work. Our experience, there's so much variability across the country that our suggestion is that if you have an opportunity to try it out as a test in a space in your lands to evaluate whether this will work, that might be a good first step. Rather than committing to a full-on investigation with radar, evaluate whether your local conditions will be useful for radar. I'm sure others have thoughts too on this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andrew. There's, I think the small-scale testing is totally appropriate, especially in known contexts, as we said before, in a known cemetery, when you know that you should be able to interpret the results very easily. If they're deep, they're rectangular, the bodies are going to be laid out, there's probably coffins, all of these things make it very easy for the GPR to work. But one thing that I think is also really important is to understand, and we've mentioned this before, the history of disturbance on your site. The GPR is picking up the grave shaft and not the grave. And so if
Sorry, Terrence, we have now lost your audio. Are you able to speak a little bit closer to the mic? Can we give this another try?
Sure, let's try. Can now you hear
Okay,
me?
we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Nightmare. Okay, let's try this again. So GPR only finds the grave shaft and not the grave, and that if there is other historic disturbance there after the grave was placed, if there's been a water line, a sewer line, construction activities, that grave is now invisible to GPR. All we see is the bigger trench. We see all of the other disturbance. It's the same density and collects water the same, and so we don't have a way to see that anymore. And so understanding exactly what's going on in the community and what previous buildings existed can really help. And this would be a good time to think of other technologies. If you have an urban setting and you have lots of disturbance, the cadaver dogs could be a way to go, or some of the other technologies you could jump straight to that might have less of an issue with the disturbance history.
And if I might add, if you're working with a company, then they will, I think, propose an investigative phase at the beginning to see if their technologies work. Sorry, I think, Charlene, I interrupted you. I apologize.
No, not at all. Please go ahead, Andrew, if you have anything else to add. Yeah.
No, that's it, that there is, again, a conversation to be had if you're working with a company about this phase. What technologies work for the lands that you are investigating? and then those can be preliminary steps to evaluate whether the technologies will work for the tasks. Again, I recommend thinking of existing cemeteries as a place to start, partly because that is a more accessible landscape to work in, and one where the results are both more predictable and expected, and there is less likelihood that you're going to find something in the soil that is, as Terri suggests, not a grave. So there's utility in starting there, helping your community understand the process, understand the technology, and understand the people that you'll be working with, and building a capacity to work with it. So, thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. And I wonder if Dr. Kisha Supernant is back. Are you here, Kisha?
I am back. I just was able to jump back in.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we have a question in the chat directly for you. How did they come to 115 from the cemetery in Gruard, and whether they have names and if we can access those names? So that question is for Kisha from Therese Morris.
Thank you for the question. So the 115 are potential unmarked graves within the cemetery, because we did a survey using ground penetrating radar as one of the areas of interest. We know that there are a lot of burials in that cemetery, and actually there's a public list of names of people buried up to 1996, which was compiled for one of the those sort of local history volumes. We used that to identify children in those records from the time that the school was open, and we have provided that list to Kukdookaa, and I believe it might be on their website, but if it's not, they have been sharing it. We don't know for sure that every child in that list was a student at Gruard, but probably a lot of them were. And the 115 doesn't represent individual names, because we actually can't do that, right? With GPR, we can't say this person or this child was here. It was just unmarked graves that we thought were in the cemetery. And then we also had results that looked grave-like outside of the cemetery as well. But Andrea mentioned that it is actually really useful to do work within a cemetery, because you can get some sense of what graves look like in the environment, and it's easier then to interpret other types of reflections and have some assurance that they look similar to ones that you know are much more likely to be graves. I can find the link to the Kukdookaa Nation website and see if they have it posted on there, and then put it in the chat for you. The report is also available on their website if you're interested, like the sort of summary of the work that we did.
Fantastic, thank you, great question. And Teresa's expressing her thanks in the chat, so thank you. I would also like to highlight a comment that Barb had made, that it says many of us are following the wishes of survivors and taking a non-invasive approach. So I think that is really important to know, that approach guides a lot of this sort of work. A few more questions here. Maybe we have time for 2 more, and then we can wrap it up by thanking everyone. And again, I'll highlight some of the mental health resources available. So 2 questions, and I'm going to say them both at the same time, and any one of our speakers can jump in to answer. So number 1, what are the ideal phases of a project? What would that look like? And then number 2, with the federal government choosing to bring in the International Commission on Missing Persons, how do you think this may affect the community-driven aspect of searches? Is there anything to be wary of when working with an international organization? So a reminder, question 1 is about the ideal phases of a project or project management, and then question number 2 is this question of the International Commission on Missing Persons and how that could affect searches.
I would be happy to start with the phased one, and would invite certainly Barb and Charlene and Whitney, who've done this in their context, that this works. But generally how my team has approached it when we're working with communities is, one, we like to do an assessment first. So like Andrew was talking about, going in, testing some areas of concern, and then making a set of recommendations. So we often base the phases on the results that we had gotten in that assessment. So step one would be, what is working, bringing out someone with expertise to evaluate different aspects of the land, put together some of that knowledge about the land history. And then we generally recommend, in our case, 3 phases. So phase 1 typically is, where are the most either well-known locations, highest priority locations. Design sort of step 1 to go and address those. Often they involve a cemetery of some kind, as well as particular areas in a school ground. And doing that over the course of a summer, perhaps. And then doing analysis from that, and then basing the next phases on the sort of results of that first phase. Recognizing, of course, around that also needs to be archival work, there needs to be survivor testimonies, there needs to be other pieces which then can help inform where you might search in the future. So we generally recommend a sort of a 3-phased approach once we've done an assessment, but it varies by community because it depends on the area to search, how effective the technology is, what is already known. Those things do play into the decisions as well.
I would also highlight the, as Whitney and Charlene illustrated, the utility of mapping and collecting spatial data almost as a step prior to actually working in the ground. You can do it at the same time. It certainly helps the ground search process, but it also acts independently to help survivors, to help you compile archival information, and to help you understand the history of that landscape over the 150 years of the institutional footprint. So that's a task that can be done, I think, at any time, and starting to build, both collecting the field data with perhaps LiDAR and drones, and then starting to build a data system of your own through technologies such as GIS. These are important pieces that you'll need down the road, and can be often the first steps in ground searches.
I think one thing that I would offer just as a point of discussion is the multiple layers of data that are often collected, and how we can interpret them like holistically together with other types of data. So it's often complicated to sort of look at the magnetometry results, and then look at the GPR results, and then pull up the survivor interview data and maybe any traditional use data. So having like a comprehensive analysis tool available where all of your data is there kind of in one spot is really helpful, and is something that we're working on in this moment. I do also just want to speak to sort of advancing the work very quickly. I know I speak from a bit of a different perspective, and I think one of the key things for WLFN is that the access permissions for the site for us are on private land, and so being that those permissions could sort of evaporate at any time has really heightened the sense of urgency for us to be out in the field. So I definitely, this more sort of I don't want to say level-headed, but less urgent approach. I champion that as well too for nations who are just getting started. But finding a way to streamline all of your data into one place is really key. And something that we are only just now really taking a broad look at, and getting all of the inputs in one place. So just offer that as a thought as well.
Maybe I could just jump in, hopefully, if people can hear me. One thing that I've noticed is a lot of the schools that I work with have a huge catchment. Many dozens of other First Nations sent children to these schools. And so I think in the initial planning and in phase 1, you really have to focus on the lead community and their stories and what they know about it. But as you move to further stages, there probably are other communities that you could reach out to. And once you show the map and say, these are the areas that we've heard of, do you know any other areas? that can be really fruitful and identify areas that you had not thought of. But it's a little much to start that with 40 different communities at once. And so I think that planning for that at some point in the future is a good plan.
And if I have one more observation, if you're advanced in this work, if you've already started ground searches, if you've already conducted ground penetrating radar, then you're facing the task that we referenced earlier, the interpretation and your evaluation of the signals and the geophysical results. And if that's the position that you're in, then just to let you know, we'll be convening a group across the country of communities that are in that position, the communities and their technical staff, to start having that collective conversation about refining that step. So if you're just starting, then this is a step that you will encounter down the road. But if you're at this step, then we're building supports to bring us all together to work on this important issue.
Can you hear me? Is my microphone on?
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead, Charlene.
Whitney, I'm not sure if you're still on the line, but do you want to respond to the question regarding the potential effects of the federal government bringing on the ICMP?
Yep, I can speak to that. I'll pop my camera back on because I feel like I'm speaking into the abyss here. I've changed my shirt. It's cold in my basement, but yeah, I think I'm always of the dual minds about things. I think definitely where involving an international organization has its pros and its cons, much like everything else. So I think definitely the strategy that's proposed for ICMP to come in and do engagement strategies regarding DNA, regarding ancestral genealogy and these types of things, and the work that they do, and sort of doing a cross-country tour of that information is important. I do know that there are a lot of questions about DNA, and there is a lot of there's a lot of understanding, but there's also a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of misinformation about what DNA can do, what it can't do. It's much like the GPR. So I very much appreciate the efforts of trying to educate in community about DNA and about the urgency of DNA. I think much like others have reservations about sort of involving more people in the process and involving more layers of bureaucracy in the process. The work at Williams Lake has been able to advance so quickly because we don't have a lot of interplay from outside government and outside entities. We're able to sort of sit down as a team, formulate the next steps in the plan, and then work with our experts sort of one-on-one to make the next steps happen. I do think that there is something to be said also for the capabilities that group may have in future. Definitely their service in other countries and their ability to bring in portable labs and to do mass disaster DNA analysis, these types of things, is something that we do need a national strategy for. We do need a sort of umbrella approach for, but I wouldn't want for it to sort of slow or stymie the progress of communities as they move forward in their work. I would never want for there to be sort of an intervention from whether it's the federal government, provincial government, or otherwise international, and say, stop what you're doing because we're now going to sort of insert this piece into the equation. I really do truly believe the work has to be led by communities, and if communities want to bring in that group to do any number of different things, or another group, like for instance, FAFG, the Guatemalan Forensic Group, has been proposed in BC as well. So where communities are ready to make that step and to integrate groups into that process, I think we need to look at it. But I don't know if that answers the question in particular, but
I just from a survivor perspective as well, I just want to make sure that I support Whitney's comments around the International Commissioning on Missing Persons. I don't think it matters who it is. I just don't want anybody, whether it's federal government, churches, or anybody, bringing anything onto me where they think they're better than me and they're educated and they can do this and this and this. Even if they did it in another part of the world, I really don't care. I'm not saying that to be disrespectful of them. I just think that, we at this point know where we're at in the work that we're doing. We know when we're ready to engage whomever, whether they be experts or otherwise, and we want to be able to determine when we're ready to do that work, not the federal government or not the churches or anybody else. So, my preference would have been to have the federal government give us the money, and we can engage ICMP if we want. Right now, my biggest worry, and this again is coming from having done some work at the Assembly First Nations or with the national organization, where once you engage somebody to do national dialogue and strategy, that's fine. Maybe that's needed, but what I don't want is for the federal government or ICMP or anybody else to think that we need 150 IRS schools on board before we move ahead with the work we're doing at WLFN, because we don't want that. We're ready to go. I don't need to wait for somebody nationally to let us know whether we can or cannot. I don't want it to delay what already is a very difficult process. And again, this is just me speaking as a survivor. I would have preferred that the whole process be set up with a panel of survivors where the experts with ICMP are advisors. They're here to advise. They're not here to tell us what would be good for us in finding our missing children. So it's just the way they approach it and how they do it. And as it is, there is no trust for the government or the RCMP or churches anyhow. So they further perpetuate that by doing what they're currently doing. So we watch and listen and see, but I don't want anything that would further delay the work that we need to find our missing children, or creating steps, and processes, again, with experts that make all the money off of the pain and hurt of our people. We've had enough of that, quite honestly. And I think, experts from the outside need to be aware of that. The other thing, maybe just to mention briefly regarding the question around what is the ideal phase, I don't, that's a difficult one, because I think it all needs to happen, in conjunction, one with the other, one linked to the other, one comprehensive approach, where you can't do one before the other, and I say that because I'm one part of the team that Whitney works with at Williams Lake First Nation on St. Joseph's Mission. And I've had the opportunity to work with people that have their masters and their doctorates, and they have enough respect for who I am and my community experience that we work really well together. So it's been good for me to be able to know, one, that I have a grandpa that committed suicide there and we will find him, engage the technology to see potentially where he might be, for me to see and understand that, but also to be a part of the research team that went into the Royal BC Museum to try and find his records, or to listen to the survivors' stories where they told us to go over to the railroad tracks, and then to see that in black and white, that, that actually was there. So, and again, going back to my earlier comment where I started, I find being engaged, as much as I can, in as simple way as I can, a very healing process. And that's what I would want for survivors, is for us as experts or technicians to not leave them behind, because every step of this has been a healing for me. And I want that for our people. There's so much trauma that we need to feel good about the work that we're doing, and how this can be community-driven, nation-based, and they can be every part of the process. So I admire all of you that are online, that are going to do this work, and the ceremonies that you have to carry on your work. Bukshem.
Thank you so much for that, Charlene. There's also thanks for your comments reflected in the chat. For the record and translation, I do want to read a question and answers from the chat. So there's a question: what would be the best method or approach to searching an area that is heavily forested. Andrew Martindale offered an answer. So forested locations are among the most complex because it is difficult to work around the plants and because tree roots appear in GPR as signals that can obscure others. It can, but we don't have many examples yet, so important to try before deciding. Kisha has also responded, I would recommend first beginning with something like LiDAR to see if you could narrow down areas for intensive investigations. Forest environments are challenging. Another option might be cadaver dogs, again, to narrow down areas for investigation. Thank you for that question. So there are...
Just also comment on that. I absolutely respect both of those answers, and I think definitely challenging for sure. One thing that I would flag as well too is the propensity for disturbance to happen in the forest. Like, we have forested areas on site that were logged last winter. So getting in touch with those forestry proponents and letting them know that you intend to do an investigation in those areas so that these types of disturbance don't happen. Definitely, I walked out into an area last spring where there were trees, and then there was now a pile of logs that had to be moved instead of trees. And the disturbance and destruction that was done in the process was astronomical. So just also flagging that as well too, is like things happen in the forest that don't normally happen on like a prairie or a flatter area that's maybe in an urban environment. So.
Thank you for that, Whitney. Yeah, and I want to acknowledge that there are many other questions in the chat. I don't think we're going to get to everything today. I also want to acknowledge that we've been online for more than 2.5 hours now, and an event like this can be quite taxing on speakers and experts, but also those who are here listening and engaging. So I think we are going to wrap up the Q&A period now. Again, a reminder that the 24-hour National Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available, 1-866-925-4419. And also in the chat, we have provided information for Sandra Delaronde, who is a health support worker. Her number is 204-806-0134. And a recording of this will be posted on the NAC website. It will be available within a week. Again, that is www.nac-cnn.ca. And on behalf of the National Advisory Committee, I really extend a lot of gratitude and thanks to our speakers here today, and to Terri Brown. Thank you so much. Hi, Cho. Our next webinar will be in March, and it will be about understanding forensics. So please stay tuned for more information about that. And to wrap this up, I would really like to invite Terri to close us in a good way today.
Okay. Thank you. It's just been such an informative session. I really want to thank all the speakers who spoke today and giving us great information. And I want to pray for all the survivors across the country and give them strength and give them hope, and along with all of their intergenerational survivors, to bring hope to them, to be strong and to move forward. Thank everybody on the panel who is giving us a lot of hope and courage to move forward, the NCTR staff, and all of these survivors on the line. I don't know how many are on the line. I did see one other or two other, Charlene and Jackie. thank you for presenting, and thank you being here. When I'm among survivors, I feel safe, I feel better, I feel loved. I just want to pray for protection for everybody. Creator of all, give us all protection and comfort during this work, and give us much hope that we will find our children. I want to do a simple closure exercise. I want everyone to place their hand on your crown chakra, the top of your head. And I want you to imagine this beautiful space and feel that heat on top of your head. That's your energy that you bring to the world. That's your hope you bring to the world. And it's very important when you talk about difficult situation to close that off. So I want you to imagine a beautiful rose closing right there on your crown chakra. And when you close the crown chakra, you bring yourself protection. You bring yourself goodness. And the goodness that you have that's always escaping there will not escape anymore, and it will bring you comfort and love and healing. And just imagine that is closing. If you want to close your eyes and imagine that closing there. It's very important that you close that. You don't want to leave yourself open to any risks or any energy that might not be good for you in your everyday life, in your work and your struggles. So close that off for yourself and thank Creator for bringing you here today. We're not here by mistake. We're here because this is our mission, and this is sacred work that you were chosen for. And it's not by accident that you are here. Feel the love of the other people and say, Madhu, Creator, Madhu. All my relations, you all have a good day, and I send all my love to you.
Thank you. Hi, Cho. Goodbye.